It's your favorite giant red-headed monster, Keith Harkins, and I'm here with another episode of Gator Rituals, in which we take a little bit of a deep dive into Florida Gator football. It hasn't been great the last couple of weeks. This might be a short and sweet podcast, so we'll just see how it plays out. But yeah, so welcome to Gator Rituals Part 4. Maybe it's 5. I don't really know. It's suddenly like week 11 of the season. It feels like we just got started, but here we are towards the end. Florida with 3 games left in the season against South Carolina, Idaho, and Florida State currently sitting with a somewhat respectable 6-3 record. I say somewhat respectable because the last 2 weeks have been complete chaos and disappointment for Florida Gator fans. So 2 weeks ago, and maybe it's good that I didn't record last week because here we are a week later, and you've essentially got 2 of the same exact performances 2 weeks in a row. Florida losing to number 7 Georgia at the time, and that was to be expected by pretty much everybody. If you thought that Florida had even an outside shot at winning that game, I would like to buy whatever drugs you're on. I'm just kidding. I've never done drugs in my life, so I don't know what I would do with it. But you know, Florida hung in there for the first half. Ended up coming out of halftime and taking the lead momentarily until Georgia broke the game wide open in the second half. And you know, it's not too hard to be upset about how the game went overall. The biggest point of emphasis, I think, for the last 2 games, and you may know exactly where I'm going with this, is incumbent quarterback Felipe Franks. He's had a overall good year, I think, overall, especially in the context of who he is and kind of what he's shown himself to be capable of. I think it's unrealistic to think that he would be near the top of the SEC in any quarterbacking category. But even that being said, I think through week 9 or week 8, he was second in the SEC in passing touchdowns. That's not really the case anymore because, again, he's had 2 abysmal weeks in a row. Against Georgia, he threw for 105 yards. And then, of course, this past week against Missouri, he was somehow worse against Missouri than he was against Georgia, against a much worse defense overall. He threw for, I think, 86 yards in a quarter and a half before eventually being benched and Kyle Trask coming in and leading the Gators down the field to score a touchdown sort of in the closing minutes of the game a little bit. Well, not really closing minutes of the game. It was in the third quarter, but it might as well have been. It was bad. Maybe I've got PTSD from it. I don't really know. Yeah, so ultimately, where does Florida go from here? They've got 2 losses in a row. One of them was maybe somewhat expected, but Missouri, I think certainly you expected them to win, or at the very least stay competitive. Missouri, of course, I think are the victims of not really a letdown, but potentially just, you know, people looking at the record and saying, oh, they're 4-4, they're terrible. They're Missouri. Drew Lock's having a bad year. They're awful. But when you look back at the record, they beat Purdue, who beat, obviously and famously, Ohio State. So using mathematics, which I'm very good at, Missouri's better than Ohio State. That's just facts. It's science. It's math. You can't disprove it. So don't come at me with it. They lose to Georgia, which is understandable. They lose to South Carolina by 2 points in maybe the weirdest overall game of the year. Certainly weather-wise, it was, you know, Missouri gets up big, the bottom drops out, and South Carolina comes back and wins by 2 points. They are then rewarded for a hard-fought loss by getting number 1 Alabama in Tuscaloosa, and they lose by a score of 39-10. Maybe a respectable score. And they turn around and beat the pants off of Memphis, lose to Kentucky in a heartbreaker. We talked about that last week in the podcast. They sort of had that weird, maybe it was pass interference, maybe it wasn't, probably wasn't, shouldn't have been called at all. And Kentucky scores on the very next play. And so they come into the Florida game with a 4-4 record. Honestly, probably should have been more like a 6-2 record. And suddenly, maybe people kind of understand better where Missouri actually is. So they come down to the Swamp. Florida paints the end zones orange for the first time in, I think, 30 years. And everyone's getting hyped up for the game. It's a bounce back game. Florida still has an outside shot at winning the SEC East. They need a lot of help. It helped that Georgia and Kentucky are playing each other that same weekend. But out comes Florida. The Swamp was not atmospheric at all. It was just, it honestly seemed kind of dead. The fans didn't seem to be into the game, and so Florida came out and got behind pretty quickly. And Missouri never looked back the whole game. Florida's defense was looking real suspect the whole game, basically. Honestly, I think that injuries are finally kind of catching up with them. They had a really good stretch there against Tennessee, even though they gave up 21 points. Some of that came in garbage time whenever they had their backups in, and then they played really good games against Mississippi State and LSU. We had talked about just how well they did against LSU's offense. Outside of one drive, they basically held LSU to like 40 yards team rushing, which is amazing. And then so here we are. We're 3 games left in the season. You've got South Carolina coming into the Swamp this weekend, and like I said on Sunday night, you can't. If you're a Florida Gator fan, if you're a Florida Gator player, if you're a Florida Gator coach, you can't come into this weekend having won 5 games in a row going into Georgia. You're 6-1. You lose 2 really rough games, so you're suddenly 6-3. And here comes Will Muschamp and the South Carolina Gamecocks. You can't lose 3 in a row, and you especially can't lose to South Carolina at home and end up going 6-4, and then potentially go into the last game of the season against Florida State at 7-4. 7-4 would be obviously a huge success given where the team was last year. Emotional victories over Tennessee, Mississippi State, and LSU all in a row. But relative success to last year is now a relative failure to how this season went earlier. And there's the whole drama of the Will Muschamp era. And now he's at rival South Carolina. He's coming to town. That's not a game that you need to have any sort of inclination or even entertaining the fact that you're going to lose that game. Obviously, you can't be cocky. That's I think that played a huge part into what happened on Saturday against Missouri. So you just can't. I'm kind of rambling here, but losing to South Carolina this weekend would, if I may be so bold, kind of nosedive this entire season a little bit. Given what's happened the last couple of weeks with Franks, we don't really know who's going to be the starter on Saturday. Kyle Trask came in and showed that he was hungry for it. Showed that he's ready to kind of take over the reins a little bit. We had talked about, I think after the Georgia game, how much of a leash does Felipe Franks have? And I was thinking that Dan Mullen's got a pretty long leash on him. I felt like at least he was going to kind of maintain that Franks was his guy. He was going to keep working with him, but I honestly did not expect Franks to come out and have an even worse game against Missouri. Just bad decision making, really, really inaccurate with his throwing. And just there was visibly and audibly frustration with the Florida Gator crowd Saturday night or afternoon, early evening, whatever, with Franks. And a lot of fans want to just go ahead and see Emory Jones, throw him in there, see what he can do. But it looks like Dan Mullen's playing it right, and he is going to continue kind of having to focus on Kyle Trask and Felipe Franks and seeing what they can do to end the season. Now, that's not to say that Mullen's not going to use Emory Jones. He's definitely going to use him. He has 2 more games to play this year before the new redshirt rule kicks in, and he burns a year of his eligibility. So Dan Mullen's not going to do that for sure. He's going to play him in 2 games. I can just about guarantee that they have him penciled in to play against Florida State, and so Florida right now is bowl eligible, and so the bowl game also counts towards his red shirt. So if he plays against Florida State, he can play against Idaho, South Carolina, or whoever they play in their bowl game. And I would imagine that that's the direction that Dan Mullen's leaning. I think he wants to take a real hard look at Kyle Trask this week, see what he can offer. He may split time between Kyle and Felipe Franks this week coming in. He hasn't really tipped his hand as to what he's going to do with his quarterbacks, but training camp this fall was pretty up and down for both quarterbacks. So I still don't think that either one has really separated themselves as the guy. Trask came in and had a really good first drive, and then I think he finished the game with maybe 40 or 50 more yards than he had on his initial drive or so. So I don't think that this is a situation where Trask comes in as this, quarterbacking savior of Florida football for 2018. I think Emory Jones is your future, so you try to do as well as you can right now with what you have, and what that looks like. I don't know. I kind of mentioned earlier that it seemed like injuries are catching up to Florida, particularly on defense. I think teams are just figuring Florida out. Florida's run defense has been suspect up the middle. They've got the speed to contain on the outside, but they're really susceptible to runs right up the middle. Teams are figuring that out. They're running all over them, and of course, Florida's secondary situation is borderline catastrophic. They've been working with essentially 2 deep at every position in the secondary, and that is not good. That might cut it in some of the high school football ranks, but that's definitely not something that you want at the college level. And so I think they started the year with 8 or 9 secondary players, and they've lost a couple since then. They've gotten 1 back, but it's not pretty. And Florida's depth on defense has been pretty bad all year. Anyway, they've got a good starting 11 when they've been completely healthy, but then after that, outside of the rotation at the defensive end position, they've been really shallow. And so that combined with the injuries, I think Florida's defense is just tired. And the bye week before Georgia didn't help, obviously. We'll see what Todd Grantham comes up with this week on defense. We'll see what Dan Mullen comes up on the offensive side of the ball. I just know that they've got to be a lot better in all aspects of the game. And on one side of the ball, special teams is something that Florida has always been able to rely on as being a really strong spot of their game. And even that was really bad Saturday. So, they've got to really regroup here this week. And I say that it's almost over. But they got a lot of work to do. As Chandler said Saturday, or Sunday, actually, there's a lot of talk about was Florida back after the LSU game, and I was very cautious to say anything in the affirmative of that. they had shown that maybe they were playing above their heads a little bit, and now they've kind of come crashing down and shown everybody that maybe talent wise they're better than a 4-7 team or a 4-8 team or whatever the heck they were last year. But are they a 10-win team? Absolutely not. Not in the SEC anyway. So Dan Mullen's got his work cut out for him this week and to finish out the year, and of course going into next year with the recruiting cycle and everything. So we'll see how they do. South Carolina Saturday at the Swamp at 11. QB TBD. So make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, and we'll get you as much news as we possibly can about all the SEC teams and their status. And that's it for me. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Gator Rituals. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week and a great weekend. I hope your favorite team wins, unless you're Alabama or South Carolina, then whatever. Have a good day.